Ever since we first presented Scoundrels and Saints, we have included among the speakers at least one scoundrel. That is to say, at least one person who has been directly involved in scandal. We've seldom, however, shared that information with the invited scoundrel. But today our two speakers who have spent much of their lives in the thick of the political fray, I think are more than equal to the introduction. We've asked them to address the question of life after a scandal. That is to say, how they put their lives back together again. The gentlemen with us today represented during their government careers both the executive and the legislative branches. And to speak first, we are going to continue our ecumenical tradition here today, and I am pleased to introduce Jeb Stuart Magruder. As Executive Minister of the First Community Church of Columbus, Ohio, Mr. Magruder is responsible for the program and administration of this 3,800-member church. A graduate of the University of Chicago with a Master's of Business Administration, Mr. Magruder held numerous positions in business and government, including the positions of Special Assistant to President Richard Nixon and of Deputy Campaign Director for the Committee for the Re-election of the President in 1972. He authored An American Life, One Man's Road to Watergate. Following his release from Allenwood Prison, he received a Master's of Divinity degree from Princeton Theological Seminary. This is his first speech to a Washington audience since the Watergate episode. And I'm pleased that he has agreed to join us today. Mr. Magruder.
Well, it is the first time I've been, how's the mic? All right back there? Can you hear me back there? A little bit. Who knows which is the real mic? Huh? I could pick this up. And one of them may have a gap in the tape, so I've got to be careful here. I do a lot of speaking around this country, but it is true that this is the first time I've been back to Washington to speak since Watergate. That's a long time. So I come with some trepidation. It reminds me of the story of the Christian and the lion, and as a Christian minister, I relate to it very directly now. 2,000 years ago, remember, the Christian didn't have a chance to speak to audiences like this. He had an opportunity to meet with the lion in the Colosseum. And on this particular day, the Christian decided that his only approach to salvation was to get down on his knees and begin to pray. And he did so, and lo and behold, he looks up, and there is the lion also in a position of prayer facing him. So the Christian says, well, now that we can begin to communicate, the lion says, communicate hell, I'm saying grace. So I hope that we can, I can leave here in one piece and go back to Columbus to life outside of the Beltway. And let me tell you, there is life outside of the Beltway. And actually, it's been very positive for me, but it was a long time. And so I'd like to talk a little bit about how I got to where I am, which may have some instruction. I was at a YPO conference in Santa Barbara, California, a couple of weeks ago. The theme of their conference was "Where Are the Heroes Gone?" And as in the same context as my speaking here, I was there were 18 different speakers, and I was represented as the fallen hero. And but I think there is a question about where heroes have gone and where have our ethical values. Beside being a minister in Columbus, Ohio, I'm also chairman now of the Mayor's Commission, the Columbus Commission for Ethics and Values. So I've not only spent a lot of time theologically at seminary and now in the ministry on the issue of ethics, but also as head of a city commission trying to deal with issues in that city relating to ethics. Let me suggest things have changed in our society for lots of reasons. And they changed, I think, somewhere in the 50s, late 50s, early 60s. And the Royal Bank of Canada in a recent newsletter suggests one answer to what in a sense, has happened in our society. They wrote that in post-Victorian times, youngsters read novels which propounded the lesson that the road to success was paved with industry, honesty, and integrity. The lesson our children receive from TV today is more likely to be that money can really buy happiness, and that there is no percentage in being overly scrupulous about how it is obtained. The old-fashioned heroes were motivated by a challenge to their character. The glamorous figures on TV today are motivated by a lust for power and greed. Now, I think our last speaker talked a little bit about what is happening here in the context of families and people in Washington, but I'd suggest that that general statement by the Royal Bank of Canada is not a bad one about the kind of changes that have occurred in our society. Now, it's not that there are not heroes or there are not the people we can look up to. I think there are. But I think it is difficult to find them because we have changed the kind of ideals that we normally associated with people being heroes. And but I would suggest that we can be heroes, but being heroes in a society like ours, I think, means probably being heroes in small bites. I think we can be heroes with our families. We can be heroes in our community, in our neighborhood. I think we can be heroes in our jobs. But I doubt if very many of us are going to have an opportunity to be the kind of heroic figure that we used to see in a Churchill and going back in other figures. In fact, in this conference, they tried to list who the heroes were in our society today, and there was not one American. It was Mother Teresa, Winston Churchill, Mahatma Gandhi. I mean, in this century, I think the question was. There wasn't one American. But I think we do have a chance to contribute, but in a bite-sized sense in our type of society. But maybe in a more direct way, we have a chance to be fallen heroes. Now, not necessarily, hopefully for you all, in the context that I was a fallen hero, and I'm not going to get involved in a discussion in Watergate. All of you look old enough to have known Watergate quite well. When I speak to college audiences, I find that they don't understand Watergate, and that's a different issue, but I don't see too many 25-year-olds here in this audience. So I'm assuming that you were around at that time and remember the history of it. Probably many of you saw the final days last Sunday night, and I've often said, people said, are you going to watch the final days? And I said, well, the only difference between President Nixon and I is when he was having his final days, I was in prison having my final days. But I do think that we, unfortunately, have many opportunities, in a sense, to be fallen heroes, hopefully not in the sense that I was. But when you think of it in our type of culture today, almost all of us have to deal with issues like divorce, business failure, minor kind of scandals, the kind that Mark Miller was talking about in the government with the husband and the wife. And no matter what it is, whether it's public or private, we still have to recover from it. Or let us say that if we don't recover from it, I think most of us will be, and in my case certainly I felt at times, that life had really concluded. I mean, I was 38 years old when Watergate occurred, and for a while I thought that was literally the end of my life in any meaningful sense. Well, what changed it? I think recovery is critical. Rabbi Harold Kushner, who's written some interesting books on hope, life in general, when bad things happen to good people, was his most best-known work, suggested that part of our problem is our fear of death and what that really means and what does it mean about life. Well, his conclusion is, as a rabbi and myself as a minister, we spend a lot of time with people who are dying. And to be honest with you, some people die in a way that's very positive, and other people die in a context that's very negative. Well, what's the difference? The difference seems to be, and the rabbi talks about it, and I would agree with him, that if a person can look back on his life and say, you know, I've really been able to contribute, or she has been able to contribute, even in a very minor way, whether it's just with your children, just with your husband or wife, maybe in your business, you can approach death and feel comfortable that it's been okay. Unfortunately, many people approach that end that is certain for all of us, looking back on their life and feeling they had made no contribution. Now, if you think about it, that would cause a tremendous fear of dying. If you look back on your life and there was nothing there, it would be very painful. And I decided early on that somehow I had to be able to reach that point in my life when I was going to pass away, that I could look back and say, in spite of what had happened, it was okay. And then let me add another ingredient. Scott Peck talks about it in his book, The Road Less Traveled. He opens the book with a great line, "Life is difficult." And I think that's an absolute given. In fact, the only people I know that have any depth are people who have had difficulty in life. Now, now and then I'll meet somebody, rare, but sometimes, who seems to have had no difficulties in life. Everything's fine. He had a great childhood, or she had a good childhood, happy marriage, and they had a great job. Their father owned a company, and now they're president of that company. They typically are shallow people because they have no understanding of life in any other context. And I think for most of us, life is difficult. When I go back and review my own life, not particularly unusual. I grew up in the latter part of the Depression. My family was poor, but everybody else was poor. Making $5,000 or $6,000 a year, as my father did, was not particularly significant to me in the sense of being poor, because all our neighbors, all our friends, all my high school and elementary school friends were equally as poor as I was. I then got on a relatively fast track. I went to Williams College, which is a type of school that people come out of feeling they can do something. It's an excellent liberal arts college in Massachusetts, and I came out of Williams feeling I could participate and make a contribution in the society. I got involved in my first political campaign there as a Democrat. I was working, my senior thesis advisor was Dr. James McGregor Burns, one of the great political scientists of our day. He was teaching, has always taught at Williams, and he ran for Congress against Silvio Conte, who is still the incumbent congressman from western Massachusetts. And it was a wonderful experience at failure, and the campaign went nowhere, and Jim Burns decided that he liked writing about politics a lot more than he liked running politics. But after Williams, I went up the ladder rather quickly, got an MBA at the University of Chicago, was in a number of large corporate structures, and eventually owned my own companies, which when I went to Washington in 1969, I sold so that I was able to come to Washington and a lower income structure without too much initial pain. And the White House years were great, at least for me, up until 1972, and then, of course, everything collapsed. Let me just suggest that Watergate is a very good example of what Reinhold Niebuhr, I think one of the great ethicists of this century, said in a book called Moral Man, Immoral Society, where Niebuhr's thesis is, and I think it's a very legitimate one, that individually you and I can be very moral in our individual actions, but that a society, whether it's Nazi Germany, as he wrote about quite often, or our own society, can, as we develop and deal in groups, we can become very immoral. And basically that's what happened in Watergate. There are lots of other reasons for it, but I think as a bottom line, I would suggest that as one of the primary reasons. The power, the self-interest was there, and it was difficult to avoid the issues that came up almost in the same sense of that case that Mark was talking about, of, why did the husband and wife do something as dumb as that? And people have said to me, well, why did you do something as dumb as Watergate, which really was, as Ziegler used to say, a third-rate burglary? We did it because we thought it was okay, not legally okay and not even ethically okay, but okay because it was the President of the United States, and we were here in Washington, and we had those limousines, and we had all that glamour that's associated with it. I was driving by the White House. My son lives here in Washington and works at the Marriott Hotel, and we were driving by the White House, and I saw, it must have been a state dinner last night. I don't keep track of those anymore. I haven't been invited lately. And so I saw all the limos, backed up trying to get in the East Gate, and it was deja vu in the sense of, there it is again. I mean, all the limos and all the power and all the prestige that goes with working in the White House and working for the president. And then we made another serious mistake also that related to that, I think. which was that we perceived Richard Nixon as God. Any time you develop an idol structure, as we do so often in our society, and treat the person, whether it's Donald Trump, the president of a company, or president of the United States, or anyone else, James Jones, obviously Jim Baker is a great example of somebody who was, in a sense, treated like God by his associates, and his fall was even more dramatic than most, because idols never make it, not in the long run. And nor do their followers, unfortunately. As we know, James Jones' followers all committed suicide. And let me make one other thing perfectly clear. I'm glad that you all are at least awake. That what we did was absolutely wrong. There's never been a way that I could ever, no matter what I studied in theology, no matter what I studied in philosophy, about the kind of things that went on in Watergate, was there anything right about it? And therefore, in our kind of system, for us to be able to move ahead, I think it was absolutely important for us to have to pay the penalties that we paid. I did not like getting sentenced to 4 years in prison by John Sirica, but intuitively I knew that it was right. Now, at a certain point in time, at 7 months, 8 days, I think it was, 12 hours, John Sirica decided I had spent enough time in prison. But the idea that we had to pay a penalty for what happened was absolutely correct for the survival of a democratic kind of society. Penalties have to be there. So I've never had any issue with that. But the problem I then faced, and we can talk about Watergate a little bit later, but the problem I then faced was that after I got out of prison, when everything, and then I went to prison and I got out, and everything then should have been okay, right? You know, you go through a crisis, and this one was 3 years in total time. And everything sort of, I had the adrenaline up all that whole time. I had to deal with the prosecutors. How could I outfox them? How could I make sure that they didn't get to me too much more than they were already getting to me? How about the press, and so on and so forth? The press were at my house for months at a time. So the adrenaline flowed, and I got through that crisis, and then everything should be okay, right? I mean, I'm finished. I'm out of prison. I moved from Washington. I realized that staying here would not have been positive for me. But things didn't get better. On the surface they did, but a marriage can really, when it's under that kind of stress, can really start to unravel. There was a lot of anger. So it was difficult with my family. I had 4 children. We moved to Colorado Springs. Now, there was good news for me because there was a beginning of relationship in my faith structure, and I'd like to talk a little bit about that. I don't want to sit here and proselytize to you, but for you to understand my story, I have to include the faith ingredient because that was very important to me. And there began to be a deepening faith. I had always been religious. Religion and faith, by the way, are not synonymous. Religion and faith can be absolutely opposite in character. I'd always been quite religious, but I started to develop an understanding of faith that was very positive. It came about, by the way, with people here in Washington, Senator Mark Hatfield, Louis Evans, a pastor at National Presbyterian Church, who is still here. But alongside that good news was the bad news of what was happening in the family, the bad news of being basically shunned in a public sense. At the time of Watergate, I remember a Gallup poll that said, took a poll of the 10 most hated men in America or people in America. I think it was an all-male list at the time. Of course, it was headed by Richard Nixon, but I was number 6. You know, I did pretty well in that poll. But that was very painful. And so I kind of meandered around this country and the landscape of this country trying to find my way. I was in Colorado Springs working for a parachurch organization. Then I went to Princeton to seminary. Then I went back to business as a vice president with a division of Syntex Corporation. And then I ended up finishing seminary and taking my first church, but I was still wandering. I was wandering because I couldn't put my life personally back together in the context that it had been before. And yet I couldn't change enough to get going. So I just literally meandered around our landscape. I remember there was a period of time, my marriage started to fail, and we had a first separation. I remember one period of time in that first separation that for 2 weeks I sort of traveled from here to there, and I realized I had no home. I had no real home. I was living someplace, but there wasn't any home, there was no community. The community and all of what I had had left really with Watergate and the aftermath. Well, I ended up 6 years ago in Columbus, Ohio, as executive minister of a large church. Columbus is a wonderful town, by the way. It's becoming a large city, 1,400,000 people, and it's a really superb place to be right now. It's growing, a lot of things going on in Columbus. But I'd been in San Francisco, and I got to Columbus, and Ohio, there is a cloud cover that sits over Columbus most of the time. I'm halfway being facetious, but weather in the Midwest, that part of the Midwest, is not always great. And so in this fall of 1984, I sat in this house that I had bought by myself with no support structure, a new job, no wife. My kids were all gone in college and later in graduate school and working. And I sat there and I got very depressed. Now, this was an accumulated type of depression because it had been going on for a period of time. I mean, this is 6 years ago now. That's 1984. That's 11 years after Watergate. 11 years. Well, I did a number of things, and I finally got a lot of help. And the doctors said eventually, and this was 3-4 months later, after tests, after all sorts of other things that I could go into, but I prefer not to, that the solution, the only solution, was myself, me. There was nothing wrong with me. I was severely depressed, had all the signs of good clinical depression, but there was nothing internally wrong. They could not find, I took personality tests, and I took Myers-Briggs, and I took the Minnesota multi-phase whatever inventory, and they said, you're okay. The problem is you've had too many losses. You've got to go home, in a sense, and solve your own problem. Well, that was very scary because I didn't quite know how to do that. So what did I do? Well, I got home, in a sense, and what happened was I was, number one, renewed by my own spiritual understanding of what life was about. I took comfort and was able to draw comfort from that faith that had slowly been developing in spite of the depression and in spite of the losses, the divorce and so on, my children leaving. I would never say, by the way, that God cured me, but there was this presence that I knew could help me. Secondly, there was a grace and forgiveness from people around me. The people at my church, the ministers I worked with at the church, there was a reaching out that occurred because they understood that I was hurting. There wasn't judgment. There was what I would call a willingness for renewal and redemption. The people were willing to say, Jeb, you're okay, and we will partake in your redemption. We will support you at this church. We'll come to your Bible study. We will listen to you, and you can listen to us, and through that process, you can get well. And I did get well. I subsequently met my wife in Columbus, got married 3 years ago, I became chairman of the Mayor's Commission on Ethics and Values, and life has changed dramatically. Let me suggest what it was not me, as we many times in our sort of me-oriented society, doing it as, in a sense, the doctor said. It was me being able to reach out and bring to my assistance people who could help me, and in some ways I could help them. And so there was this process of what I would call redemption. These words, redemption, grace, forgiveness, are words, unfortunately, that are not used very often in the secular society. We tend to look at words like competitiveness and profit and loss and so on. And I would suggest it would be to our advantage to listen to some of those kind of words as we deal with each other, because all of us fall. It's only a question of how and when. So my ministry in Columbus has been to those who are searching, ministry to business people, to people in the government. The state capital is in Columbus, who are having some of the same issues that I have. They know they can come and talk to Jeb because Jeb has had those issues. So let me just conclude my formal remarks that I think life is process. I think we can recover. There is always hope. let me end with a speech by Winston Churchill, my hero. It was the shortest speech in the history of humankind. I think he gave it to Harrow School in 1940. England, of course, was under bombardment by the Luftwaffe. The days of the British Empire looked like they were gone. And he was asked to speak at Harrow and tell the kids what to do about life. So he got up and he gave a 6-word speech, and it's been a motto of mine, and I think it's a motto for all of us. And he said, never, 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 never give up. Thank you very much. What's going on, at least, or seemingly going on in this country, as to is there any kind of litmus test that you can apply to yourself so you guarantee that you will avoid any problem of this kind. Sure, there are things we can all do, I think, and I think both Congressman and I talked about some of the kind of things that we did afterwards, and I think you could apply those before to some extent, and we all would avoid lots of pain in our lives. But on the other hand, the whole concept of perfection is one that really bothers me in our society. This idea, one of the reasons I think the Japanese are doing so well is forgiveness and an understanding of human frailty is part of their culture, part of their religious culture, part of their heritage. And mistakes are okay in Japan. I think it's been a great, powerful tool for them to understand that. We tend to expect perfection. We expect it from our public figures, and we expect it from everyone else as well. And of course, perfection doesn't occur. So to sort of set out some kind of ritual or some rules or guidelines or whatever to say that we can therefore be perfect and avoid any scandal or avoid any problem would mean that we would avoid living. So I think, yes, on one hand, I'm sure we both would give lots of advice on how to avoid the kind of things we got involved in. On the other hand, to be not involved in anything means not to live. So I think there's a balance, and I'm very concerned about this lack of understanding that perfection simply is not a part of our culture, of our personhood. And to expect it is ridiculous. Yet our figures, our public figures particularly, are held up to this perfection mold, which of course doesn't exist. Well, I don't think we should, by the way, accept any act that we understand to be, illegal or immoral or unethical, as an example. We don't have to accept the act, but I think we need to be much more kind to the person. Everybody makes mistakes. Every day we get up and talk to our wives and husbands and so on and so forth. We get into all sorts of kind of things. How many little white lies do we tell every day and so on? I think the New York Times had reported a study that was made by some institute that claimed that the average American told 17 lies a week. And I said to them, I thought they were absolutely wrong because I had counted them up the last week and I only had told 13 lies. So yes, I think we have to be careful of the acts, but I think we have to be much more forgiving of the people.
I suspect the New York Times tells more than 17 lies a week.
Question is, how can religion contribute to the promotion of ethical conduct in America?
Well, since that's my business now, I would have to suggest that it has a great deal. But I think both of us, I hope, have indicated what's really going on. And the word religion can connote a lot of great things, but also can connote a lot of negative things. So I'd rather take it out of the context of, quote, religion and put it more in the context of spiritual development, faith development, issues of that kind. Because what they do is as what I hope we have shared, is that there is in our inherent personhood an understanding that we didn't get here on our own. I think just by the fact of what this world is all about, we know that somehow there's something more important than you and I. Now, as a Christian minister, as a Presbyterian, I believe in it as Jesus Christ and God connected in that sense. If you're a Buddhist, you do it through other terms. It doesn't matter really what the terms are. The point is that we have this understanding that there is something more important than us. Now, when you have that understanding, It makes it simpler to avoid the kind of problems that are so prevalent in Washington, where as I said, where idols reign. And the idols here are power primarily and influence. In New York and other places they may be money. Religion or faith, spiritual understanding helps us put those in perspective. And no matter what we may feel about life, no matter how poorly paid or overpaid we may be, it isn't going to matter later. And I don't mean, quote, in eternity, I mean later in our lives. Again, dealing with people who are at that stage of life in their later years, when they may have a lot of money or they may have very little money, they may have a lot of power and very little power, none of those count. So I'd suggest that the issue of faith and spiritual life through religion can be extremely important in putting life in perspective. I was a director of the inaugural just before the end. And if you run an inaugural, you know, you've got all the kind of power that goes with having all the cars and all the seats for every event and so on. And I had more friends for that 2-month period of time than I ever had in all my life, and about a month later I lost them all overnight. And that was self-protection on their part. But it did show me that the kind of friendships that developed because of power and prestige had almost no meaning whatsoever when it really counted. And the people that I then became close to were people who I may have known before, but they were not my associates in the context that I had worked in the White House. And I had to go out and do just what I think the congressman is talking about, finding other people who understood what was going on. And that made a tremendous difference. Louis Evans, the minister at National Presbyterian Church, Mark Hatfield, who is a tremendously powerfully spiritual person who understands the kind of issues we've talked about. So those were my new friends, and they made the difference for me at that time. Well, I have my oldest son's 29, and he has followed my career path a little too closely, I think, at times. He went to Williams College, where I went to. He's now got an MBA. His first job after graduate school was with Booz Allen and Hamilton, a large consulting firm, and I used to work for Booz Allen and Hamilton. He works for one of the senators here as a volunteer. He's in New York, but he helps this one senator who's quite well known. And I've said, Whitney, you're looking too much like your father. You better be careful. And that is my advice. I think we need to be, and if I were here, I think I'd be much more careful. We get careless with power. And we see a lot of that in this society, a lot of careless behavior. And I think we have to be very careful. What are we really here for? What's life all about? What's our job in the government about? And if we don't understand that, then I think we can get in trouble.
I, as a conservative, would, if
Well, I have my oldest son's 29, and he has followed my career path a little too closely, I think, at times. He went to Williams College, where I went to. He's now got an MBA. His first job after graduate school was with Booz Allen and Hamilton, a large consulting firm, and I used to work for Booz Allen and Hamilton. He works for one of the senators here as a volunteer. He's in New York, but he helps this one senator who's quite well known. And I've said, Whitney, you're looking too much like your father. You better be careful. And that is my advice. I think we need to be, and if I were here, I think I'd be much more careful. We get careless with power. And we see a lot of that in this society, a lot of careless behavior. And I think we have to be very careful. What are we really here for? What's life all about? What's our job in the government about? And if we don't understand that, then I think we can get in trouble. I think I'm the only Watergate figure that is, in a quote, been appointed to anything of any substance within any governmental structure. And I am an official chairman of a mayor's commission in Columbus, Ohio. And people have said to me in Columbus, people in the press, others, well, are you getting back into politics? And I said, absolutely not. What I hope to do in that commission, what I hope to do in my ministry, is participate in the process like I had hoped to do when I was here in Washington. I didn't come to Washington to get involved in Watergate. I came to Washington because I wanted to participate in making this country a better democracy. But it is, for me anyway, positive to be back a little bit into that forum, because I can contribute, I think, because of where I've been. The good part of it is I don't have to get back into it the way I was before. I'm able to deal with the political structure in Columbus and make some impact without becoming part of it in the same sense that I would have 20 years ago. And that's a tremendously positive situation, because I can sit there and be with the mayor and be with other people in the government, both in Columbus and the state of Ohio, and participate without having to be part of it in the same context. And that's a tremendously different way to participate. And so I would encourage people who get into these issues to try to use their expertise, but I certainly would never work in politics again, because the event was so painful. But it is nice to at least be able to use some of my background now in a positive way.
The question is whether most appointees and elected officials come to Washington to do a good job of the public service, or whether you think they're here for self-gratification.
Want to go first?
Okay.
Don't both rush in now.
Politicians and government employees are like everybody else. They're people. I think most people are basically good. We all have a little, as Reinhold Niebuhr would suggest, or Carl Jung, there is the dark side of all of us. And so life is a continual tension between taking the good side that we have in our personality and our personhood and making sure that predominates more than that dark side. I think most people who work at coming to Washington or work at being in politics at a state level are good people. But again, we can all be manipulated. We can begin to think that we are really important people, and that's when I think most of our problems happen. Our problems happen when we begin to think like our press clippings say we are, and that usually is the beginning of difficulty. I think most people are good people. Most attempts at rules and regulations only come about because there is no seeming other way to deal with the issue. The problem, of course, with that is that you have one rule here, there is another way to break the rule. Let's just take campaign spending. After 1972, everybody said we have to reform campaign spending and take it out of the hands of individuals, and we put it in the hands of the PACs, and now we have a much more serious problem in the fundraising area and with the political action committees. I don't think rules and regulations ever help, particularly when we're talking about the kind of things you are speaking about. What's happening, I think, is a pendulum. The pendulum is always swinging in our society, and the problem, of course, is if you get caught at the wrong time when the pendulum is swinging the wrong way, you can get in deep trouble. The pendulum is now swinging over for coercive kind of measures to tell the public that we're not going to deal with scandal anymore in the government, and so on. And the fact is, of course, this will not change what happens. It may change the context of what happens. And then the pendulum will start swinging back down the road some other time. And life is the series of pendulum swings going one way or the other. And we're in a period now where things that 20 years ago may have been accepted are no longer accepted. But the real change that I think needs to occur, because there are problems, is a change that comes when we, in the heart and in the mind, as I think was what Bob said, was when we understand the human dimension. I mean, one of President Bush's great lines, I think it's a wonderful line, is the 1,000 points of light. That's how change occurs, by the way, in a society. It occurs as we individually try to make a difference in whatever context we can, not because of rules and regulations. Let me add one more issue. What really counts is leadership. If President Nixon had told his administration that he was not going to tolerate the kind of things that went on in Watergate, there never would have been a Watergate. Same would have been true with Iran-Contra with President Reagan. I think George Bush has done a good job in setting a tone that has said to his people, we're going to have basically an ethical kind of administration. My guess is he's going to have a lot less problems than those other presidents had. And it's a factor of leadership. And that's much more important than any rules and regulations and oversight committees and so on.
I think that's a good last word for us today. In this session, we want to thank you both. You've been candid, you've been thoughtful, and I think it's been most worthwhile session. Thank you both.